Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
I'm really glad you could all join us this afternoon. The talk today is by Paul Collins, recently of Portland. Paul came to Microsoft Research a couple of years ago to talk about one of his books, Banvard's Folly. And if you're interested in reading something about great innovators that failed horribly, Banvard's Folly is definitely the book for you. It's fantastic and funny and just incredibly well researched. Paul also does a great website called collinslibrary.com that you may want to check out, full of just amazing esoteric facts that maybe you didn't really need to know, but every time I read them, I discovered I really wanted to know about that fact. Paul is here to talk today about his new book called Not Even Wrong, Adventures in Autism. And I would dare say that this title was probably going to win Best Title of the Year for the Microsoft Visiting Speaker Series. It's very interesting for me coming to work at a place like Microsoft. It's very different in sort of the general personality than many other places that I'd worked. And I think reading this book has explained a lot of those behaviors to me, and perhaps a lot of those behaviors that I have in myself. I'm very pleased that Paul is able to chat with us about it today. Please help me welcome Paul Collins.
Thank you. I'm going to start off today with a little bit from the book. Like most parents, I think probably with autistic kids, my wife and I had no particular point at which we slowly began realizing that our son was somehow different. It really, in our case, came upon us fairly suddenly. We were just visiting a pediatrician, and we were quite used to the way our son acted, and we just thought, well, you know, he's interested in reading from a really early age, and in math and in music. And, he's just a late talker. You know, he's just not that interested in talking, and he kind of does his own thing. And of course, what seemed entirely typical to us, as soon as our pediatrician saw him, she said, "Have you considered having your child tested for autism?" And we were kind of taken aback at the time. It's one of those things where, in retrospect, when you look at it, you go, "Oh, of course." But it didn't seem so obvious at the time, and so he had to go through a whole series of tests and evaluations. And this is the first time we had actually someone come over to our house to observe him and evaluate him. Mindy turns to us. "Well, I'd just like to observe Morgan a bit in his home environment," she gestures around, and see how he interacts with you. And, oh, what lovely old books. She nods at our piano. On top of it is a teetering pile of ancient Victorian books that look like they belong in Roderick Usher's library. A volume titled Desultoria, Recovered Manuscripts of an Eccentric, sits squarely in the middle. Yeah, we're overrun with the stuff. I eye the piano and its load of books. I expect it'll send us crashing into the basement by next year. Morgan walks back in, quietly shuffling a deck of arithmetic cards. He loves arranging and rearranging cards. We're constantly having to buy decks for him. Every time we go into a supermarket or a drugstore, he'll just grab them off a shelf, tear them open, and they're ours. 7, he announces flatly after examining one. He grabs my hand and pulls me over to an old comfy chair and thrusts my hand into the cushion. "You want me to sit down with you?" I sit down, and he nestles up into my lap, examining more cards. "Morgan," Mindy asks him, "what are you looking at? What are those?" 4. "What is that?" she presses. "Is that a card?" 4, he whispers. I look down at the card. 3 plus 1. I look up, but they've moved on to Morgan's room, where Jennifer is showing Mindy around. I stroked Morgan's hair. "You're a very smart boy," I whisper in his ear. A few minutes later, Morgan is bouncing around impatiently in the living room, waiting for his computer to boot up. "Isosceles triangle," he streaks past us. "Rhombus." He's been going through a geometric phase. He leaps effortlessly onto a couch, scrambles onto its arm, and jumps down onto the cushion, rebounds off onto the floor, and ricochets into a rocking chair. This he stands on while expertly balancing himself and wobbling the chair under his feet. "We've often thought of covering the house in gym mats," I admit. "Does he do this often? Climbing onto furniture? Like that?" Well, not like, not specifically. He'll climb anything. He just likes climbing and jumping." Morgan vaults gracefully off the piano bench. "And so there's been no physical problems? No awkwardness, clumsiness, epilepsy?" "Oh, no. He's been perfect." "And he is perfect." "Well, he's perfect to us." But we felt as though as though our inevitable parental pride had the outside world's stamp of approval. As a baby in San Francisco, he was cute enough to get scouted out of a crowd by a photographer working for the Gap. Would we come in for a baby Gap test shoot? We felt simultaneously wary and not a little flattered. There was something unsettling about the idea of modeling our child, even if just for a pajama suit with bunnies all over it. But we needn't have worried. Jennifer took him to their studio, but the shoot just couldn't begin. Morgan would smile when he felt like it, and not smile when he was asked to. He wanted to examine the photographer's gear. He couldn't care less about the photographer. He didn't say cheese. He didn't watch the birdie. He didn't notice the toys and the rattles the assistants were shaking. The photographer and the crew were stumped. "Sorry," Jennifer told the crew, while being politely shown the door. "He's not a people person." So that was our first encounter with getting Morgan evaluated, and of course he did wind up being diagnosed with autism, and this sort of, I guess, plunged me into the history of it for a couple of reasons. One was simply just wanting to understand the condition itself better. The other was that I'd actually already spent a couple of years working on what was going to be a book about someone named Pierre the Wild Boy. He was one of these cases of a feral child being found out in the woods. And there were a number of sort of famous cases like this, particularly in the 1700s and 1800s. But no one had written about Peter. He was found out in the Black Forest in 1725 in Germany. And he was actually brought back by George I to the court, to the British court in London. And people were fascinated by him. He was someone who was clearly intelligent, and yet, and clearly had the capacity to speak, and yet didn't seem much interested in interacting with other people and in speaking. And they simply did not know what to make of him. There was no way to even conceptualize how someone could be like this. And so people came up with all kinds of theories. He had been raised by bears in the wild, and that this was the natural state of man, that if you didn't have civilization, that this was what they would have termed in that era, that sort of your noble savage, that this was sort of somehow the ideal early state of man. And there was even an early evolutionary theory that came out of this. A guy named Lord Bombado, who was a Scottish judge, came up with this theory in the 1780s that people were somehow descended from apes. And he was quite convinced of this. And in fact, to the point where he thought people still had tails, and that midwives were secretly cutting them off at birth. And so he would burst into the rooms trying to catch them in the act. Unfortunately, he didn't really come up with any theory as to how there could be any descent from other animals. He didn't have anything like natural selection. So he got ridiculed for his ideas, and the world had to wait another 70 or 80 years for Darwin. But Peter was also kind of a linchpin to his theory. So anyway, I'd been drawn to this figure and was researching him. And then my son got diagnosed with autism, and it was around the same time that I started realizing that there was some idea that Peter might have been the earliest case of, or one of the earliest recorded cases of autism. It sort of dawned on me that I'd been fascinated by this all along for a couple of years without even knowing, I guess, that the relevance of it was right in front of me. And in looking at the history, what I found was that autism is a pretty recent concept historically. It didn't get discovered, per se, until the 1940s. And it's one of those weird accidents of history, but it got discovered really by two people at the same time, both coming out of the University of Vienna. Hans Asperger, who actually stayed in Vienna and was working at a pediatric clinic, and Leo Kanner, who had emigrated to the U.S. and was working at a clinic at Johns Hopkins. They were doing their work during the wartime. Neither of them, since there wasn't exactly a lot of communication going on between Austria and the U.S. in the 1940s, unless you consider weapons a form of communication, neither of them knew about what the other was working on. And amazingly, they both came out with these papers in 43, 44, where they described this condition and they both gave it the same name of autism. It's just sort of one of those weird historical accidents. Kanner's work became a lot better known. The reason being, it's pretty hard if you're a researcher. Asperger's clinic got bombed in an Allied bombing raid. And that pretty forcibly took him off the scene as far as people getting to know his work. He survived, in fact, worked for decades more on it. But his work wasn't even translated into English until almost 50 years later. And that's why, really, it's only been in the last 10 years or 15 years that people have started getting much of an idea about Asperger's syndrome. Leo Kanner in the U.S., when he was looking at autism, he was looking at what we might consider more profound forms of autism, or sort of classically defined autism. What Asperger was looking at, he had these kids being brought into his pediatric clinic who were being described to him as, they'd be brought in and they'd just say, we cannot educate these children. We do not know what to do with them. So you take them. And what he was getting was these kids who could not socialize in a typical way, wouldn't follow any kind of instructions at all, would just sort of go off and do their own thing and be fascinated by their own things. Frequently, things like math, music, they'd go around memorizing the entire tram schedule for the Vienna transit system, things of that sort. Nobody knew what to make of them. And Asperger not only wrote about these kids, he also did a follow-up piece on them in, I believe in the early 70s. What he found was that these ineducatable children, supposedly, in many cases had grown up to become mathematicians, musicians, professors of astronomy, and so forth. And so this was really the first inkling, I think, around that time, and then when his work got translated in 1990, that there could be a real spectrum of autistic behavior. And it wasn't just cases of profound autism, but that you could have less severe forms of it as well. Not to mention autistic traits showing up within families, even though a person might not be autistic per se. Anyway, in looking up all this stuff, I started learning a lot more about some of the genetics involved and some of the familial aspects of it. And this is what really surprised me. And I'm just going to read to you a little bit from that. Lost in the long silence after the Allied bombing of Vienna was a remarkable observation made near the end of Asperger's 1943 thesis, one whose implications were not recognized for decades. We've been able to discern related incipient traits in the parents or relatives, he wrote, in every single case. So, if shadowy precursors of autism can be seen in an autist's family, if it shapes their very minds and talents, what might you expect to find? Well, perhaps men whose solitary pursuits, deep focus, and fascination with logical systems was matched only by their social awkwardness. One of the researchers that's working a great deal with us right now is Simon Baron-Cohen in Britain at Cambridge University. And his comment on this was, the paradigm occupation for such a cognitive profile, Cohen has theorized, is engineering. When 1,000 British parents of autistic children were then surveyed, the children proved to have fathers working in engineering at double the national rate. Science and accounting, solitary professions requiring deep focus and abstraction, showed even higher multiples in autistic families. And artists, particularly visual artists and musicians, were represented at nearly quadruple the normal rate. When Baron Cohen and other researchers narrowed their focus to the highest echelon of academic talent, that is, the students at Cambridge, science majors had autism in their families at 6 times the rate of literature students. Sort of an interesting aside, one thing they did find with the literature students was that they had astronomically higher rates of manic depression in their families, which, if you've known a lot of science students and known a lot of literature students, might not surprise you. Baron Cohen's results led some to dub autism geek syndrome. Computer programming is probably the most famously geeky profession. But when you remember that programming is a subset of mathematics, you realize why math departments are sometimes jokingly referred to as a jobs program for autists. Math is pure geekdom. And one of Baron Cohen's most striking case studies is of DB, a brilliant mathematician with 2 other mathematician brothers. A 4th brother is a low-functioning autistic. Their father is a physics lecturer. DB seems to be fairly socially successful, since he did manage to get married to another mathematician. Yet DB was so oblivious of basic social interactions that, quote, until he was told it was odd, he would run everywhere, down corridors, streets, etc., even if he was not in a hurry, just because it, as he said, seemed efficient. Some autists express great fondness for Star Trek's Mr. Spock, whose plight mirrors their own, the logician from another world, baffled by our own. But such otherworldly eccentrics have always been a constant in math, right alongside the value of pi. One 19th century comic lithograph, titled Mathematical Abstraction, shows an absent-minded professor seated between his breakfast table and the fireplace, gazing intently at an egg in his hand while his watch boils in a saucepan. It was only a slight exaggeration of the greatest prodigy in Britain at that time, Sir William Rowan Hamilton, who worked in a dining room covered in snowdrifts of notes, barely interrupting himself to eat when his family brought him a pork chop. After his death in 1865, the dining room was opened and, one colleague reported, the literary remains were wheeled out and examined, and china plates with the relics of food upon them were found between the sheets of manuscript, plates sufficient in number to furnish an entire kitchen. But it was that obliviousness to the interruptions of the outside world, Hamilton once explained, that made his line of work possible. The only difference, he said, between an ordinary mind and the mind of Sir Isaac Newton consists principally in this, that one is capable of a more continuous application than the other. There is something endearing in such minds. I've always been partial to John Francham, the 18th century mathematician who, as a teenager, spent a 25-pound inheritance on a pony. Not to ride, he explained, but to make a friend of. Whereupon his physician concluded that the young man was, quote, out of his wits. Francham invented a ball and cup game that he played incessantly until he caught the ball 666,666 times. He wrote on philosophy, but he could be thrown by the simplest activities. Once, when writing in a letter asking for money, he was utterly stymied by the fact that he had never folded a piece of paper before. He never did send the letter. It's funny, I actually finally managed to come across some of his papers, too, in Britain, so Francham may make a bit more of a comeback in the future. He's been a very obscure figure, but a very singular personality. One aspect of autism that's really struck me, as my son gets older, and as I've met a lot of other people with autism and parents of autistic kids, is the tendency, of course, not only to focus, but to focus on specific things over and over again, to have a real fascination with certain activities or certain objects, things that other people might not even bother to pay attention to. And there's some real classics in that regard. Trains seem to come up a lot with autistic kids. I don't know if there's just something about the combination of the mechanical aspect of it, and you have a system with a schedule, and there's something very appealing in that, it seems. And I've often wondered whether train spotting in Britain, which would seem to be a pretty inexplicable activity to a lot of people, starts making a lot more sense when you look at it that way. It can be almost anything that people will become fascinated by. They'll become fascinated by memorizing refrigerator parts. They'll become fascinated by music and by pop music trivia, dinosaurs, dolphins, and so forth. And you'll meet autistic kids who can tell you everything on whatever particular subject it is that they've just got this passionate interest in. And I'm just going to read to you a little bit from the book about a couple cases of how this can not only not work out, in some cases really cause problems, but how it potentially can work out quite well, too. One of the strangest news stories in New York over the years has been the legendary subterranean exploits of Darius McCollum. McCollum was first arrested in 1981 at the age of 13 for impersonating a subway conductor. Growing up at the 179th Street train yards in Queens, he had memorized the entire New York City subway system by the time he was 8, and he kept endless notes on the movements of these trains. He hung around the repair yards to learn signaling, electrical repair, and conducting from old trainmen. They were glad just for the company, and they gave him uniforms, keys to the system, his own orange emergency lantern, truly everything he ever wanted. The crews loved him, and they treated him as one of their own. Only, he's not. His record for imposture, for wanting to be a transit employee, keeps him from ever actually being a transit employee. His attempts to apply for the jobs go nowhere. But he's convincing the crewmen who don't know that he isn't one of them, and so lovable in his enthusiasm to those who do know that sometimes he drops in and works with them anyway. At other times, they'll actually call him in for assistance. Every time that McCollum has been nabbed driving a train, there are dozens more where he hasn't been caught. But after spending a few weeks working shifts driving de-icer vehicles, checking for busted electrical equipment, and pulling late-night assignments making track inspections, he generally winds up being caught by some administrator. McCollum has been arrested 19 times now. His most recent capture got him thrown into a maximum security prison for a 5-year term as a repeat offender. He's now confined to his cell 21 hours a day. And because he's in his own world and nonviolent, he's kept away from the other prisoners for his safety. And in that cell, he glumly hangs up handmade signs on the bars reading, "Train out of service." He just wants to be with the trains. It's all he's ever wanted. He could probably be the best crewman that the Metropolitan Transit Authority has ever had, but they say they have no choice. Yet sometimes, it can all go right. There's one couple in LA with a son obsessed by all things relating to trash and recycling. He's memorized the garbage collection routes, the makes and types of the disposal vehicles, and he talks of little else. So they arranged with the local garbage men to have a 7th birthday party for him out at the local landfill. The Los Angeles Times sent a reporter to cover it, blissfully unaware that perhaps this boy was, well, even more different than he seemed. "We don't know where this interest in trash came from," they quoted the boy's mother. "He's been this way since he was 2. But both parents say that they're fine with him spending his life working with trash if that's what's making him happy. He said, the Times reporter duly noted, that he wants to go to college so that he can learn to drive a trash truck. Good for him. One thing I've really been struck by in looking at these sort of things is the role that social pressure does and doesn't take, I think, in one's in one's interests and in one's pursuits. And one of the fascinating things when you see how autistic kids get interested in things like this, and they get interested in trash or in trains, or in my son's case, he's really become quite fixated on the inside of the piano in our house. He basically wants to take it apart, and it's kind of a running struggle to keep him from demolishing our piano. But he's fascinated by all the moving parts. And one of the things that really started to strike me when I was watching this is that these interests are really not dictated by any sense of what is socially appropriate or what society thinks a kid should be interested in at that age. If they're interested, and they don't particularly care about your opinion on the matter. And this brings me to the last thing I'm going to read to you, which is my son became interested in possibly the most unexpected TV program imaginable in this regard. And I've since actually learned, since doing a few readings of this, that there are actually several other kids who have had exactly the same reaction. I'm in my office leafing through a book that I recently found, Ellery Walter's 1928 autobiography, The World on One Leg. Yes, it is precisely what its title promises. I'm at the chapter set in Fiji. After being denounced as a one-legged devil, our hero and his sidekick hear something whistle past them while they eat dinner in a hut. By the flickering flame, he writes, we saw a long, cruel knife deeply embedded in the matted wall. Then I start to hear something whistling. It's coming from downstairs. When I reach the living room, I find Jennifer and Mark smiling and watching Morgan as he stands in front of the TV, where he's blowing maniacally on a little wooden recorder. And he's keeping time with, I turn to Jennifer. Are you trying to warp our child? It's Lawrence Welk. Oh, honey, he loves it. Look at him. It's true. And the Lawrence Welk Orchestra is, well, not jamming exactly. But, actually there's this woman doing an accordion solo, and I have to admit that she's rocking out. Wow, Mark says. They need a mosh pit. Morgan is ignoring all of us and presses his face up to the TV to get the full Welk surround experience. He's fascinated by the orchestra, especially when the tubas and trumpets kick in. Even before he could walk, he was transfixed by radio ads featuring saxophones. He now has a brass band album that he loves. He'll put it on, and he'll just sit in front of the stereo with the speakers framing his head, basking in the sound as though it's the warm glow of a sun lamp. The camera pulls out to show the whole Welk Orchestra, revealing over them the giant sign of the show's sponsor, Geritol. We all burst out laughing, except for Morgan. He's still dancing. And why not? There are no uncool interests to Morgan, no peer pressure, because there are no peers. There are other autistic kids who like watching Laurel and Hardy, or golf games, or listening to Bach incessantly. If they like something, they like it, and they don't really care what you think. A tap dancer comes out, clicking away to the accompaniment of the orchestra, and Morgan gleefully jackhammers his feet against the floor, and then he sort of moonwalk shuffles a few steps backward. He's delighted. We should tape this stuff for him, Jennifer says. Yeah, I nod. Sure. Let's start taping Lawrence Welk. And we do. Anyway, I'm happy to take any questions that anyone might have.
How did you come up with the title for your book?
The title is actually, probably a lot of you recognize the reference to sort of a famous line by Wolfgang Pauli, the physicist, who, when he was sort of dismissing a colleague's theory that he just thought was so far off base, that it didn't even almost bear any thinking about. He said, "He is not even wrong." And the reason that phrase leaped to mind for me was that when you look at the way that someone with autism has to deal with a social situation, and they're not responding to certain social cues or to body language or certain expectations that people have, it's almost as if they're not giving the wrong response to people. Because to give the wrong response, you have to know what the right one is in the first place. You have to know what the set of expectations is to, in effect, go, "I'm going to ignore you," or "I'm not going to respond to your question," and to be doing that deliberately. And I think that's, in that sense, I mean, Wolfgang Pauli meant it as a put-down. To me, it's just almost more of a descriptive idea in terms of socialization, that you could say them in a way they're not even wrong. They're not dealing with the same set of parameters or the same set of expectations when they're interacting with other people. And so for that reason, the reactions can seem kind of inexplicable to someone that has a certain set of expectations or social cues going into a situation like that. Sure. Mm-hmm.
Well, researching your book, have you come across any interesting, your point of view, theories on why there is such an increase?
Yeah, as far as what theories there are about the increase in autism, that's something that there's a tremendous amount of debate over, and part of it being, as is often the case with such things, that there's disagreement over whether an increase is even occurring. My own feeling, just sort of anecdotally, is that there certainly does seem to be one. There's no question at all that there is a tremendous increase in the number of diagnoses of autism, particularly over the last 10 years or so. One of the things that has come up is this increase due to there being a wider awareness of it, and also that there's more awareness of the idea of the autistic spectrum, that people aren't only diagnosing profound cases of autism, but they're also picking up more like Asperger's syndrome and things like that. And then there's also the question is there an actual increase in the number of cases? It's not just a question of diagnoses are being made more accurately, but there's something actually happening that's causing it to occur more often. It seems to be a bit of both. One thing that they found in a study in California last year was that diagnoses are, been something like quadrupling over the last 10 years, but that also the number of cases of profound autism, which probably wouldn't have gotten missed before, and that's not something that people wouldn't have been picking up on 10 years ago. Those have been going up quite rapidly as well. So that would seem to indicate that something is in fact happening as far as there being a greater actual rate of autism. And there's a lot of argument about what could be causing that. The one thing that everyone seems to be more or less agreed upon is that there's a very strong genetic element to autism. It does seem to run in families. One does seem to have genetic predisposition to it. As to whether that fully explains it or whether it's you have a predisposition and then some environmental influence then triggers it, that's the $20,000 question. And of course, kind of famously over the last few years, people were blaming vaccines. People have also blamed various additives, elements of diet, chemicals. None of these theories so far seems to have panned out. The vaccine theory seems to have been pretty thoroughly refuted, and none of the other ones that have been picked up on so far seem to explain it either. So it's very much of an open question. Mm-hmm.
Parents of an autistic child, as well as, I presume, a regularly functioning child. I have one of each as well. At what age and in what ways did you introduce to the regularly functioning child the concept of autism and what that means and why the other child acts the way they do. My regularly functioning child is 4 and my autistic child is 2, and she gets it that he can't speak, and then he goes to therapy for that, and she doesn't get the bigger picture about why he's so aggressive and why we can't discipline him with timeouts, the way she gets a timeout when she does the same thing. And I'm just curious how you handle it as a parent.
It's been difficult. And, I mean, in my case, it's actually, we have a second child on the way. Excuse me. It's something in my eye here. But he's on the way, so it hasn't come up yet. And I don't know how we're going to handle it. I mean, you know, I think it's something that we're going to, pretty much as soon as they have any sense of it, we're going to discuss it and try to have them have some understanding of this. But you know, it does seem like with other parents that I know that have autistic children and a typical child as well, it's something that they try to make clear from the beginning. And certainly, kids seem to be able to understand the idea of behavior. That, you know, they'll just, well, my brother acts this way. But as far as the extent to which this can cause problems with other kids, or even, you know, the idea that this is a, you know, neurological condition and things like that, it's fairly, you know, abstruse stuff for a 4 or 5-year-old to take in. I'm not sure how one handles it. You know, it's something that one has to finesse, I guess. One thing that certainly does come up a lot is the issue of, you know, that in a way, the siblings do kind of become their brother's keeper. And you know, virtually every parent I know of who has both, you know, autistic and typical children, this comes up. That one thing is that you know, fairly universal concern among parents, but particularly among parents of autistic children is, you know, what will my child do when I'm gone? And when you have a child with any kind of a disability, that concern just sort of goes up exponentially. And so, you know, one does hope that one's, you know, siblings can watch out for them a bit, and in some ways can kind of be their, maybe their ambassador to the world. At the same time, that's a pretty hard thing for a sibling, you know, to have that responsibility. And it's not something I think I would ever necessarily tell a sibling, you're expected to do this. That might strike a child as pretty unfair. But you know, I guess as a parent, you sort of hope that you'll be able to raise them in such a way that they will look out for each other. And I think that actually siblings can really be important in that regard, because as a parent, you're viewing every situation as a parent and from the level of a parent, you know, literally. And whereas a sibling might have a better sense, or at least be better able to interact with other children and help introduce, you know, their brother or sister to these other kids. But to answer your question, I don't know. I don't know what the magic formula on that one is.
I was just recently visiting a school, and they were saying that they now have all kids of all abilities in class together, so an inclusion model.
Right. And
they kept mentioning that they have autistic kids in all levels of the school. I just wondered what your thoughts were on, you know, a school for autistic kids versus the inclusion model.
Right, the specialized autism classes versus an inclusion model. I'm really torn, because this is actually something that's coming up for me right now. My son is going to be entering kindergarten this coming year, and in Portland they had a autism-specific class. They had 2 of them in the city, you know, where they had autism specialists working in the classroom, and you know, you could feel pretty well assured as a parent that you would know that your kid was going to a classroom where people would understand why he was acting that way, and they could work on, you know, on whatever issues or challenges that you know, your child is likely to have. Well, now they're switching to an all-inclusion model. And so now it's like I don't know. I don't know if his teacher is going to know anything about autism, and I don't know what level of help he's going to have. And on the one hand, there's I think it probably just depends on the child. I'm sure that there are children who benefit a great deal from inclusion. That if they can be in a supportive classroom environment with neurotypical kids, that not only will they, be able to do well in school and have a worthwhile school experience, but it will also get them interacting more with other kids and just more accustomed to those sort of social interactions. It's also pretty easy for any parent to imagine any number of nightmare scenarios where your kid is just becomes the problem child of the classroom, and the teacher doesn't know how to deal with them, doesn't want to deal with them, is overwhelmed by the issues, and is just not equipped. And it's sort of a roll of the dice. In my case, we just have to see how it goes. It would be nice if he could go to his neighborhood school and get to know his neighborhood kids. And so if it works, it'll be great. If it doesn't, it really won't be great. So, yeah. I do think, though, that for kids who need it, I think it's good to have autism-specific classrooms, because, my guess is that inclusion works well for a lot of kids, but it might not work well for all of them. And, there was another writer on the subject, Val Paradis, who put out a book called Elijah's Cup a few years ago about her autistic son. And at the end of her book, she talks about going to school with him. And, this is sort of an agonizing experience for a parent, watching her kid basically being snubbed by the other kids, or they're sort of taking advantage of him or making fun of him. And it's just, heartrending to read this. And I asked her, well, what happened since you wrote that? And she said, well, he was really miserable, and he, on the verge of being suicidal. This is like an 8-year-old boy. And she said, I pulled him out. I put him into a school with other autistic kids, with other kids with Asperger's, and he's happy, and he's learning. And, so I sort of see the benefit of that, too. I think it's great for a kid to be able to be mainstreamed, but not at the expense of their sanity. Not if it's going to make them miserable. That's not worth it. Mm-hmm.
If I may, at that point, there's a pretty good book which I can recommend to any parent who's dealing with this right now. It's by Paul Cook, and it's called "You're Going to Love This Child," and it's about inclusion, how to screen schools, how to get schools to actually do what they're supposed to do. An inclusion model without support is not inclusion. Right.
That's a good point. Talking about the book, "You're Going to Love This Child," about inclusion, and yeah, I think that's really true. That inclusion, it doesn't mean just throwing the child into a classroom. There has to be some kind of support. And, I think in the case of my school district, frankly, and this is just a guess on my part, I think they switched to an inclusion model for financial reasons. I think that they're having a lot of budgetary problems, like many school districts, and I think that part of their decision was motivated by the fact that they felt overwhelmed by the budgetary needs of so much in the way of specialist staff in classrooms. And, maybe it's possible to do it with fewer people in an inclusion model, and that would be great. But, there has to be something. There has to be some kind of support.
I was wondering if you could address the issue of disciplining a child.
Of disciplining?
With autistic behavior.
Yeah, that's a hard one. How one disciplines a child with autistic behavior. I guess it really depends on the child. I mean, as a fairly crunchy, chewy, liberal parent, I'm loath to be too much of a disciplinarian with my child. Yeah, at the same time, like with any parent, you need to set boundaries, and you need to get across to your child what they can and cannot do. And the realm of or sort of the spectrum of autistic behavior really varies in this regard. I mean, some kids with Asperger's don't really have any disciplinary problems per se, except that they maybe don't pick up on cues or follow instructions in the typical way or whatever. But they're not. It's not like they're somehow being really disruptive. It's just that they'll tend to go off and do their own thing and maybe not pay attention to what you're asking them to do. And that can go all the way up to cases of autism where you have children that are biting and kicking and punching and thrashing around and just physically really problematic. This is something that I really grapple with, because in my son's case with Morgan, he never lashes out at anyone. He's never aggressive towards people. What he will do is, if he's doing something and you interrupt him, and you try to lead him over to whatever, he'll just shove you away. Or if you try to pick him up or lead him somewhere, he'll start thrashing around and kicking. Someone else has to come in and be bugging him for that to happen. It's not like he's picking fights or something, but he has a hard time understanding what a proper reaction is to someone bugging him or to breaking his concentration. And like a lot of things with him, we keep repeating. We go through sort of explanations or step-by-step type things where we try to get him to calm down and try to get him to understand what's not appropriate. But it's not easy. He still does it sometimes. And, part of it, too, is us trying to understand what gets on his nerves. But, yeah, I do think that, certainly, I guess to some extent it's been a matter of both trying to get him to understand our expectations and, in a way, us kind of coming to understand his. That there are certain things where he's just going to really have a hard time reacting in the way that you would expect or desire out of him. And in some cases, there's certain battles that I just decide I'm not going to fight that one. It's not worth it. There's other things to deal with.
What do you think? I have actually two questions about Asperger's. The first one is, do you think that it being a spectrum, is there a hard boundary between it and being normal? Like, if it causes the problems for a person and nobody else notices it, is it a problem?
Yeah.
And the second one is that I've read, you mentioned manic depression, and I have read someplace on the internet that many cases that were previously diagnosed as manic depression are now being re-diagnosed as Asperger's. What is your opinion on that? Do you have any other info on that?
The question is about how much of a boundary is there exactly between sort of autistic spectrum behavior and Asperger's and what one might call neurotypical behavior, and also the relation between things like manic depression and autism. I think that the line between them is pretty fuzzy. I mean, to some extent, lines have to get drawn for, I guess you could say, medical or bureaucratic reasons. When you have school districts or doctors that need to be able to give a diagnosis or not, because that helps determine what kind of aid someone gets or what kind of additional assistance at school and that sort of thing. That puts them in a situation where they're having to create categories and they're having to create criteria and saying, well, if this child is doing this, this, and this, they have an autistic spectrum disorder. As with many such things in real life, the boundary is actually a lot fuzzier. And to me, that's one of the interesting things about Simon Baron-Cohen's work and Asperger's work, where they noted the tendency of these same traits to show up in the families of people who had been diagnosed with autism. That while the fathers and uncles and brothers might not be obviously autistic themselves, very frequently there were certain aspects that were pretty clearly related. And I discovered this in myself. I mean, when he talks about things like engineers and accountants and so forth showing up a lot in these families, I looked at my own family. My dad's a mechanical engineer. My brother's finishing his PhD in computer science. And my wife's side of the family, my father-in-law was a math major who became a musician. And so these were, this is almost like the trifecta. These were all the kinds of professions that Simon Baron-Cohen was pointing out as being amenable to people who had these kinds of, one might say, autistic tendencies. And this was true of myself as well. This might be an experience that a lot of parents have in this regard. I was actually in special ed as a kid for a couple of years. And in my case, it was initially thought I had a hearing problem. And I remember taking all these hearing tests over and over again in like first and second grade, and they could not figure it out because I would be in a classroom and a teacher would say something to me and I wouldn't respond. I would just be, I would just be off in my own world or reading or whatever, and I would just ignore them. And they thought, well, he's got hearing problems. Well, then they would take me in and test me, and not only was my hearing good, it was actually substantially above average. And they just couldn't figure out what was going on. That would probably now be described as would be an auditory processing issue. That, and in this regard, when I see how my son acts sometimes, I really get it. Because when I'm focused on something, when I'm working on something, everything else goes away. I block things out, and I'm really focused on that thing. And I literally don't hear. I'll hear sounds. I'll hear kind of like in the old Charlie Brown cartoons, just hear wah, wah, wah. But they don't form into words. Not until I finally break my focus and turn to that person and focus on them. And it's also the same in like a really crowded room. When a lot of people are talking at once, I find it kind of overwhelming. It's like white noise to me, and it's hard for me to pick out anything. And I'd never thought about any of these things particularly before until my son was diagnosed, and then it's, between that and my stint as a special ed student, which had never made sense to me because I'd always been, really solid academically, and I could never quite square that with the rest of my my academic career. And then it suddenly started to make a lot of sense. That here were, and I see this in my brother as well. And suddenly, where a lot of behaviors, if they're not autism, they certainly have a pretty strong relation, or there are elements of autism in it. So, yeah, I think the boundary is very fuzzy, and there may not even be one particularly. As far as the relation between things like manic depression and other disorders with autism, one of the most fascinating things to me was there was a study that came out in 1981 where by Lorna Wing, where you recall in the early 80s and sort of the early years of the Reagan administration, a lot of mental hospitals and institutions started getting shut down, and in some cases people just basically turned out into the street. And in one of these institutions, I believe in Oregon, they were shutting down this institution, and they did exit diagnoses of everyone in this place. And it was very interesting. There was, I think, something like 500 patients there, and roughly half of them, like 250 or 260 of them, were found to have autism spectrum disorders. Half the people in this institution, and a lot of these people were people who had been admitted, in some cases, in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, before the concept even existed. And they had been diagnosed with everything but autism. And for that matter, a great number of people, even after the 40s, after autism, the concept was around, when the concept hadn't really taken root yet, or people were still kind of hazy on what it was, an immense number of patients were being diagnosed with all kinds of other conditions. And so, I think it's interesting to realize that probably for much of the 20th century, a great many people who were institutionalized had autism disorders of one sort or another, and it just wasn't recognized. People just didn't know what it was. The other thing that's sort of interesting about that, too, is that there's also a lot of other conditions that occur along with autism much more frequently. Epilepsy being one of them, synesthesia, even things like perfect pitch. These would all seem to indicate something in the nature of whatever series of neurological changes that are happening, probably very early in someone's development, that these seem to all cluster around certain types of activities or certain types of behaviors.
Based on the research that you've done in the past, do you have a vision of what the future is going to be like for our children and possibly society?
Well, I'm as far as the future for autistic children, I feel one thing I'm it's sort of a mixed blessing in some ways. The fact that there has been such a rise, I mean, it would seem almost really shocking rise in the number of diagnoses of autism over the last 10 years. I mean, that, in terms of public health and things like that, it's a very troubling phenomenon. However, one aspect of that is that it probably means that the current generation of children who are being diagnosed with this are going to have a lot more available to them and a lot more support available to them than past generations, because there's an increasing recognition that this is a really pressing issue for a lot of people. Probably, I would imagine, going to be a lot more funding for research into this as well. And so, I think that people who had autism certainly up through the 70s and really well into the 80s, for that matter, you probably faced a really difficult time in dealing with educational institutions and with health issues and any number of things, because there wasn't much understanding by people of what it was, and there just wasn't much recognition of what kind of support was needed. Now there's a lot more research going into it. There's a lot more media coverage. That I think is actually really important. A lot more people are becoming more aware, even if it's only in a fairly general way, of what autism is and how how someone with autism is liable to encounter other people. And I think that might help maybe make it a little less difficult for our kids to interact with other people, and hopefully make people a bit more understanding and a bit more patient. So in that regard, I think things are looking up, and I'd like to think they can only improve too. Thank you.
Paul can stick around for a little while if you'd like to ask him any questions one-on-one or get a book signed.